We're actually in part 8 of the series called His Last Days. This week we'll be discussing the burial of Jesus. Specifically, we're going to be in verses 38 through 42. While you're turning there, let me tell you about one of my favorite classic films. It's the 1954 Hitchcock thriller called Rear Window. It stars Jimmy Stewart, Grace Kelly, Raymond Burr. It's about a photographer in a wheelchair who spies on his neighbors from his Greenwich Village courtyard apartment window, much to the chagrin of his fashion model girlfriend, Lisa. And during one of those restless nights recovering from his broken leg, L.B. Jeffries keeps noticing that one of his neighbors, Lars Thorwald, is making strange trips out in the middle of the night, each time carrying a large travel case with him. Now, Jeffries also notes the conspicuous absence of Mrs. Thorwald. And he becomes convinced that Lars Thorwald has committed a monstrous crime, and that during his frequent nocturnal trips with the large travel case that he has been carrying out, you guessed it, Mrs. Thorwald. It's all incredibly suspenseful. You see, you've got Thorwald's supposedly sinister secret. Then you've got Jeffries and Lisa keeping their suspicions secret from Thorwald while they're snooping around looking for clues to his guilt. Secrecy is a major plot theme in the story. Now, the same holds true for our text today. John chapter 19, verse 38 through 42. It details Jesus' burial and the actions of two, what we'll call secret saints. Okay, now what's a saint? Saint is basically someone who's been made holy, been made righteous by God. It's a title for all Christ followers. Okay, not simply those, recognizing those long dead people who were totally dedicated to God and did amazing things. No, if you're a Christian, you are a saint. Well, in this passage, we see two prominent figures. We've got Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, secret followers of Jesus, now suddenly showing boldness in claiming the body of Jesus. Now, the death of Jesus actually moved them to spend lavishly on Jesus' burial, despite what it might have cost them both personally and professionally to take these actions in broad daylight. Now, why is this significant? Well, there's several reasons, but here's the big idea I want you to get. That the day Jesus died was the day that death was buried. But Jesus' death forces us to make a decision about his life. And that decision: am I a secret saint or am I a public proclaimer? So let's read the text together. John chapter 19, beginning in verse 38. It says, "After this, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, because of his fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might remove Jesus' body. Pilate gave him permission, so he came and took his body away. Nicodemus, who had previously come to him at night, also came, bringing a mixture of about 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes. They took Jesus' body and wrapped it in linen cloths with the fragrant spices, according to the burial custom of the Jews. There was a garden in the place where he was crucified. A new tomb was in the garden. No one had yet been placed in it. They placed Jesus there because of the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby." Now, with the advent of the internet, you'll find that tabloid magazines are not nearly as prevalent as they once were. I mean, once upon a time, you could go to the supermarket and pick up a whole slew of them. I mean, there was Us Weekly for your celebrity gossip, the National Examiner, the Star, the Globe, the Weekly World News, the Sun, and the granddaddy of them all, the National Enquirer, whose tagline was, "Inquiring minds want to know." And here's the thing about those tabloids. The purpose of these publications, besides making lots of money for the publishers, was to expose the truth. Well, they frequently left more questions than answers. In fact, many of them found themselves on the business end of lawsuits because much of the truth that they reported was actually fabricated. And yet there are still people who read that stuff today who believe every word of it. Now, I think it's ironic that many people in our culture today really struggle with the historical truth of Jesus' life. In fact, in recent years, pollsters have documented a decline in the belief that Jesus was actually a real person, much less that he died and rose again. Now, for many who say that they do actually believe that Jesus is real, it seems that reality has very little impact on their day-to-day living. In fact, like the characters in our text today, there's some believers today who really struggle to live a life that openly declares their commitment to Christ. But see, the fact is that Jesus' death actually empowers us to reveal faith instead of keeping it secret. We don't have to be secret saints. We can all be public proclaimers. Okay, so 3 very simple things I want you to notice in the text this morning. We'll discover the first one here at the first part of verse 38. We see a secret covered. There it says that Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because of his fear of the Jews. So this guy, Joseph of Arimathea, he's mentioned in all 4 of the gospel accounts of Jesus' burial. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish religious council. And Luke 23:51 says that Joseph was waiting for the kingdom of God. In other words, he was looking for God to restore the glory of the earthly kingdom of David, to put Israel back on the map, so to speak. And so suffice to say, Joseph was much more than just a casual religious dabbler. But as one who was so deeply immersed in Judaism, Joseph's initial focus was likely on those rituals of religion, of Judaism, that he felt were necessary to ensure that earthly kingdom. See, he wanted to satisfy God with his own righteousness. Only later did he realize that true righteousness comes through Jesus. That a right relationship with God can only come by faith in Jesus and the righteousness that we receive in him. And so now, as we discover in John's gospel, Joseph had been very carefully carrying out this secret discipleship in response to Jesus. But to put it more simply, he followed Jesus in the shadows. Now, we've also got Nicodemus mentioned here in verse 39. He had a similar story. John chapter 1, verse 5. This is in John's prologue to his gospel. In that prologue, John wrote that the light shines in the darkness, and yet the darkness did not comprehend it. And we actually kind of see that played out in Nicodemus's life in a very powerful way in John chapter 3. You remember Nicodemus, who was also a member of the Sanhedrin, had previously been identified in the Gospel of John as a spiritually curious but extremely cautious member of the Jewish leadership. And so to avoid detection, Nicodemus came to see Jesus at night under the cover of darkness. Now here's Nicodemus coming to see the light of the world, Jesus, under the cover of darkness. And during this exchange in John chapter 3, Jesus made a special point to highlight Nicodemus' lack of understanding. So here's one in spiritual darkness, not yet comprehending the true light. It's safe to conclude that both of these learned Jewish scholars were deeply puzzled, curious about Jesus' new teachings and the authority that he taught with. It seems, though, that they were definitely open to what Jesus had to say during his earthly 3-year ministry, but they had not yet made a wholehearted commitment to Jesus. So they would have kept their faith questions hidden. For the same reason that any Jewish religious leader would have. Their status in the community would have taken a serious hit, sunk to new depths. Their religious, they might become religious outcasts. Their financial portfolio might have suffered significantly. After all, who in their right mind would do business with a Jesus follower? They might have even become victims of violence. Now, no doubt, some of John's readers back in the day would have identified with Joseph's quandary. But you know what? Readers of the Gospel of John still identify with that today. Do I risk losing my business connections to follow Jesus publicly? Can I bear the ridicule, the possible harm that might come to my family? Our community connections might be jeopardized if we're associated with that itinerant preacher who claims to be the Son of God. I mean, to quote a popular song, what will people think when they hear that I'm a Jesus freak? Well, it appears that both men initially chose to cover up their secret belief in Jesus. So first there was a secret covered. Here's the second thing I want you to notice. There was a secret confronted. Look at the end of verse 38. It says, Joseph asked Pilate that he might remove Jesus' body. Pilate gave him permission, so he came and took his body away. Nicodemus, who had previously come to him at night, also came bringing a mixture of about 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes. They took Jesus' body and wrapped it in linen cloths with the fragrant spices according to the burial custom of the Jews. Now, I think it's kind of funny that back in 2011, the CIA declassified what were likely the oldest government documents still held in secret by the National Archives. And because they did, yes, now you too can make the same invisible ink used by Germany in 1918. All it takes is crushed aspirin and some pure water. You see, there is no secret that will not eventually bear closer examination, come under scrutiny. Now, there's some secrets that we know they just kind of naturally leak out over time. There's 3 preachers on a fishing trip. They weren't catching many fish, so one of the preachers suggested it would be nice if they would each confess their biggest sin to the other, and then they would pray for each other. And so they all agreed. First preacher said, well, my biggest sin is I like to go sit at the beach and watch the pretty women walk by. Second preacher said, well, I like to go to the racetrack every now and then and put a small bet on a horse. Turning to the third preacher, they asked, brother, what's your biggest sin? And with a grin, he said, well, my biggest sin is gossiping. Some secrets leak out. Other secrets are really often, well, they're revealed by someone who's needing to unload a burden. Back in 2006, there was 2 women dressed as 19th century washerwomen, and they set themselves up in a Manhattan storefront. And they underlined these words on the glass: air your dirty laundry, 100% anonymous, free. And so onlookers were encouraged to write down their deepest secrets on a piece of paper. And those confessions were then displayed in the window for all to see. And there was all sorts of different responses. For example, the hermit crab was still alive when I threw it down the trash chute. Or, I want to see SUVs explode. Those people are so selfish. Or, I make fun of this one friend behind her back all the time, but I get freaked out when I think of what she might say about me. Or, I'm about to start an affair. Or, I haven't yet visited my dead parents' grave. Or, I'm dating a man and getting financial compensation in exchange for the guilt. I'm 25 and he's a millionaire. It pays to be young. You see, there's something about the human heart that just finds it really difficult to keep secrets. I mean, even if your secrets truly went to the grave, they're still going to be confronted on Judgment Day. Now, the scriptures really don't give us a detailed timeline of either Joseph's or Nicodemus' spiritual journey. Obviously, all the secrets, the questions, the conclusions that they had long kept secret, they're now being confronted. They're being closely examined through the lens of Jesus' death on the cross. Now, on one hand, they've got all of their long-held national and cultural and religious convictions, but many of those are now being brought into question in light of Jesus' claims about the kingdom of God. And so there's this internal conflict that's brewing within these men as their credibility, or the credibility of their secret beliefs is really being affected by the presence of their rabbi up on a cross. Jesus is dead. Does that now negate their belief in his teachings? Well, you see the story of Joseph and Nicodemus' encounter with the truth of who Jesus is. That's the story of all humanity. That the everlasting God has come in the flesh. He has spoken and he has lived God's truth. And it's up to us to decide, will you receive it or will you reject it? You see, God created you with free will, so he's given you that freedom to choose. Revelation 22:17 says, "Come, let the one who is thirsty come." You can decide to come to Jesus. Oh, but you're not free not to decide. Because choosing not to decide, that's a decision in and of itself. You can't be like Pilate, who wanted to wash his hands of the whole affair and let the people decide for him. See, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 12, verse 30, that anyone who is not with me is against me. So by choosing not to choose him, you've already made a choice. But here's the thing. If you choose to follow Jesus, it means being united with Christ in the likeness of his death. In a death like his. Now, what do I mean by that? Because that sounds pretty scary. Paul said in Romans chapter 6, verses 4 and 5, we are buried with him by baptism into death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we too may walk in newness of life. For if we have been united with him in the likeness of his death, we will certainly also be in the likeness of his resurrection. Following Christ, church, means dying to your old self, to your old way of life, and being raised from that death into a new life in Jesus. And baptism is the most beautiful picture of that. In fact, we've got 3 baptismal candidates that we're gonna baptize next Sunday. It's going to be a beautiful way to start off our Easter celebration. But you see, to be united with Christ is to first be confronted with the truth of our sin and his sacrifice for that sin. Joseph, and very likely Nicodemus too, had reached this crisis of spiritual confrontation. Secret beliefs were now being scrutinized in light of Jesus' crucifixion. So what's Joseph going to do here? Is he going to use his position of prominence in the community to maintain what he had publicly made known his entire life? Or would he take the most visible stage in Jerusalem and suddenly make this secret pursuit of Christ known to all? Well, he chose the second option. I mean, he ripped off the proverbial Band-Aid by going directly to the Roman governor Pilate to ask permission to bury Jesus. So no longer was he covering a very carefully kept secret. His secret had been examined in the light of all the truth claims of Jesus Christ. And though his rabbi was now dead, Joseph was now siding with Jesus. Now that shows us a third thing from the text. We'll call it a secret canceled. Look at verse 41. There was a garden in the place where he was crucified. A new tomb was in the garden. No one had yet been placed in it. They placed Jesus there because of the Jewish day of preparation and since the tomb was nearby. So, secrecy may have been a theme of this passage, but not for long. You know, these now revealed secret disciples of Jesus are made known. According to the traditions of the day, you know, Joseph and Nicodemus, they could not give Jesus a proper burial. I mean, one that was respectful and it still be secret at the same time. Now, while the Romans didn't care what happened to Jesus' body, Old Testament law had very specific guidelines for burial. And as evening approached, they had very little time to act. Now, why the rush to burial? Well, not only was it the usual Jewish custom to bury a body within 24 hours, but as we discussed last week, the Sabbath was closing in fast. It would have been unthinkable for them to handle a burial on that holy day. And so nobody would have been able to deal with the dead body if the two men had not acted when they did. But you see, the fact that Jesus was buried on a Friday, that he rose on a Sunday, was yet another fulfillment of prophecy. Matthew chapter 12, verse 40, Jesus predicted the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth 3 days. Now, some of you are doing the math in your head. I know you're thinking about it. Okay, Jesus died on a Friday afternoon, rose on Sunday morning. Eric, that's not 3 days. Need to remember, though, but by Jewish reckoning, as was their custom, any part of a day was counted as a full day. So the fact that Jesus was in the tomb for part of 3 days was still a fulfillment of that prediction. Yet again, we see God in his sovereign control, using the sense of urgency on the part of these two Jewish religious leaders to orchestrate yet another fulfillment of prophecy regarding Jesus' death. But given the type of work required to prepare Jesus for burial, this was not something that could easily be done in secret. Now, I can still remember the first time I worked collecting hay bales. Man, was I sore the next day. I mean, it hurt just to move. I was an out-of-shape college student whose best friend, Ben, was a youth pastor at a small country church in rural Missouri. One of the farmers in the church needed help collecting hay. So one Saturday afternoon, Ben, his younger brother Dave, and I went alongside the farmer's flatbed truck through his fields, picking up 70-pound hay bales and tossing them up onto the flatbed truck to haul back to his barn for storage. I mean, it was quite the workout. I mean, there was all kinds of huffing and puffing and grunting and groaning going on. I mean, it was kind of hard not to notice how miserable we really were. I mean, our secret was out. We were wimps who really struggled with a 70-pound load. Well, you see, the spices used at Jesus' burial weighed about 75 pounds. So hauling off a grown man's body and hauling approximately 75 pounds of spices, that would not exactly have been a clandestine operation. I mean, these were publicly known Jewish religious leaders performing a religiously defiling task in handling a dead body and doing it in a public venue. They were sure to be found out. And it's highly unlikely that Joseph's audience with Pontius Pilate went unnoticed either, because people talk. I mean, in the ancient world, people talk. I mean, they talk today. Word would have gotten around, so the secret was out. Both Joseph and Nicodemus had turned from viewing life from their old perspective to looking at it through a new lens. No matter that Jesus was dead, no matter that they had buried his claim of being the Son of God behind a stone, I mean, even though all Jesus taught them seemed to be buried with him, they were now all in. But you see, almost every single detail in this passage was the fulfillment of prophecy. Isaiah had predicted that men would plan to bury the Messiah with the wicked, but that instead he would be with the rich in his death, a sign of honor toward the Messiah. We see that in Isaiah 53:9. There's a brand new tomb in a garden, which obviously would have belonged to a rich man. And Matthew's gospel tells us that Joseph used his own personal tomb for the burial. So Joseph and Nicodemus were secret saints no longer. Despite the backlash they knew that they would face from the Sanhedrin, these formerly secret saints did this very public thing in burying Jesus in support of their rabbi. And in so doing, they learned to count the cost of following the Lord. You see, neither one of these men actually appears in the Jewish records or traditions of the time. Presumably because they were labeled as traitors to Judaism, and that their names were erased from those records because of it. Christians, may we be as bold in our faith to risk facing a ridicule from the world, to risk losing the praise of men, to risk losing our status in the community, or to face a downturn in our own financial portfolio because we have chosen to publicly proclaim Jesus as Lord. I mean, if you really want to wrap this passage up in a nutshell, it highlights how the seemingly unexpected can play a crucial part in the plans of God. Now, the details of the burial of Jesus may not stand out to some in the overall story of his death and resurrection, but it holds great significance. Not only in fulfilling Old Testament prophecy, but also in highlighting the love and devotion of two of Jesus' most unlikely followers who have now gone public. And it begs the question, what about you? Are you living with boldness, courage? Are you trying to live as a secret saint? Trying to hide who you are in the workplace or in the community? It's funny because, anyone that believes that they can hide their relationship with Jesus is just sadly mistaken. Because if something is real on the inside, it's eventually going to show on the outside. I once had a coworker of mine years ago who claimed that she was a part-time Christian. Folks, it's not possible to be a Christian only some of the time. You're either a Christian all the time or you're not a Christian at all. Because to seek Jesus is to live his life, is to live a life that's exposed by the light of Jesus. Which takes me to this passage in 1 John chapter 1, verses 5 through 7. John says, this is a message we've heard from Jesus and declare to you that God is light. There's absolutely no darkness in him. If we say we have fellowship with him, and yet we walk in darkness, we are lying and not practicing the truth. If we walk in the light, as he himself is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of his Son, Jesus, cleanses us from all sin. So how do we take what we've read in these few verses about Joseph, about Nicodemus, how do we take that and live it out in our own lives? What do we learn from this? How do we apply it to the Christian life today? I'll tell you, for starters, here's one thing you can do. Have courage. Bible says 365 times, do not fear. Have courage. Stop living in fear. Don't be afraid of what other people think about you. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 6. We may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? You see, the only person whose opinion of you truly matters is God's. And he loves you. I mean, he provided a way for you to know him. God left heaven, became a man, lived a perfect, sinless life, died on a cross so that we might have relationship with him. So let's be inspired by that. Let's be inspired by the boldness and the courage of Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus to follow Jesus with all of our hearts, regardless of the adversity that we might face. And let's fulfill our roles in God's plan. Instead of secret saints, let's be public proclaimers. Here's the second thing. Honor Christ. Remember his sacrifice. Reflect on that sacrifice that Jesus made for your salvation, for your redemption. And let his love and sacrifice inspire and motivate you to live a life that honors him. Like Joseph, like Nicodemus, strive to honor and respect Jesus in every area of your life, even in those difficult and challenging situations. Here's the third thing. Help the church. Serve the body of Christ with sacrificial love. Show love and devotion to Christ by serving others selflessly, sacrificially. Just as Joseph and Nicodemus cared for Jesus in his burial, let's care for one another by serving one another. And here's one more. Hope continually. Embrace the hope of the resurrection. Man, we're going to do that in a big way next week. We're going to embrace that hope. Just as Jesus was buried and rose again, remember the promise of new life and eternal hope that his resurrection brings. And trust in his victory over death and believe in all of the eternal promises that come through him. And live in readiness for his return. Be prepared, be vigilant for the return of Jesus Christ, knowing that his victory over death brings the hope that comes from his imminent return and the fulfillment of the rest of his promises. But I got to ask you this morning, are you ready for the return of Christ? See, the big idea today was simply this, that the day Jesus died was the day that death itself was buried. But Jesus' death forces us to make a decision about his life. Am I going to be a secret saint, or am I going to be a public proclaimer?